A UN commission has found Israeli authorities responsible for carrying out war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. The report says Israeli authorities committed the crimes of starvation, murder, intentional attacks against civilians, torture and outrages upon personal dignity in Gaza. Evacuation routes and designated safe areas were consistently targeted by Israeli forces that the commission determined amounted to the forcible transfer of people. Israel imposed a total siege constituting collective punishment and denied Palestinians essential necessities such as water, food, electricity, fuel and humanitarian assistance for strategic and political purposes. The report says Israeli forces also committed acts of sexual violence, torture and inhuman treatment in the West Bank. Plus, it calls on the Israeli government to immediately implement a ceasefire, lift the siege of Gaza, ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid and cease targeting civilians. It also urges the Palestinian government and authorities in Gaza to cease all rocket attacks on Israel and unconditionally release all hostages. The commission also found Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups responsible for war crimes, including deliberate targeting of civilians and taking captives. Well, Navi Pillay, the chair of the UN's Commission of Inquiry, presented the report's findings to the Human Rights Council in Geneva.
Israeli authorities are responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including extermination, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, murder or willful killing, using starvation as a method of war, forcible transfer, gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys, sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture, and cruel or inhuman treatment.
Michael Mansfield is an international lawyer and joins us live from Birmingham in the UK. Good to have you with us. First of all, what do you make of this report?
Well, I think it's an extremely opportune and important report because, of course, it has to be remembered that in the background we have the ICC has, through its chief prosecutor, issued warrants for the arrest of various individuals, alleging exactly what the UN committee has found. So it is the justification for what he was doing, if it was needed. It is needed because you had an automatic response from America, which was, as well as Israel, to criticize and almost punish the International Criminal Court for daring to even investigate, let alone issue warrants for their arrest. So it seems to me that this is an important report on that scale. Next, also, alongside, you have the International Court of Justice, where South Africa was litigating the whole issue of the crimes being committed, and particularly in the context of genocide and the Genocide Convention. Well, this report goes further than anything so far, and the court has been very reticent and has only talked about plausible rights and so on, but actually this establishes, it seems to me, a very strong, not just prima facie case, but goes further than that. I'm not going to say conclusive, but it's certainly a long way towards being conclusive. So I think it's a very important report when you look at the International Court of Justice. And finally, of course, the UN itself. If it's going to bring out these reports, it's got to do something about, not just call for a ceasefire, maybe it's got to consider the possibility of intervention here, which, of course, the Charter originally allowed for, in order to stabilize areas of the world where warfare essentially was getting out of control.
But you say that, but do you think it will spark any actual action?
Well, immediate action, no, is the straight answer to you. It isn't. But it is on another front. I left the action to last because I know the problems with the United Nations and the Security Council and the divisions and all the rest of it that we're familiar with between America, Russia, and the UK sitting on the fence, as usual. However, I think the importance of this report is to counter the really quite disgraceful attacks on the ICC doing its job and duty properly that has been brought about by the US, supported by Israel and the United Kingdom. What do they say? Oh, well, it doesn't help. I mean, that's about the weakest response you could imagine. So it seems to me this report can now be used by those who are approaching litigation of any kind, domestically or internationally, to say we have an authoritative report here. Seems to me it's authoritative, and you're not going to do much better than this. And it seems to me that should be fueling all the initiatives, including the other possibility on a domestic front of the BDS campaign, where people are boycotting and divesting and sanctioning a country which is involved, Israel in particular, and not the only one, obviously, but Israel mainly is focusing on, well, the word's been used, extermination.
But, of course, it just plays more into Israel's narrative, doesn't it, that the UN is biased against it. The report calls for an immediate halt to military operations, but we know that it's simply going to be dismissed by Israel.
Yes, my observation about Israel is that it doesn't matter what the organization is, unless the organization is supporting its objectives and its priorities, then it is automatically either regarded as and called anti-Semitic, or it is regarded as hostile to their objectives and so on. So, I think whether it's the UN or any other organization, the fact is there isn't another organization with any credibility internationally. And it seems that this is a very important step. And if we're going to at least look towards the future of a kind of civilized situation, then the United Nations has to be given support. And the political, as it were, divisions that are right at the top, as it were, in the Security Council, they have to be reformed. It's a very good case for reforming how the Security Council works. The rest of the United Nations does some incredible work, particularly providing aid. Aid in a circumstance where Israel and others accused, so you know what the situation is.
Absolutely. Michael Mansfield, we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us there from the UK. Okay. Let's cross over now to Geneva, where we can speak to our diplomatic editor, James Bates. He's at the UN Human Rights Council, where that report was briefed a little earlier. James, the report is a stark reminder, isn't it, of the brutalities of this war. It gave an extensive list of war crimes.
It really is a very detailed report and very, very grim reading if you read all of it, summing up what has happened since the 7th of October. The session of the Human Rights Council on the Commission of Inquiry, hearing from the Commission of Inquiry, has paused for the lunch break, which means we're able to speak to the chair of the Commission of Inquiry, Navi Pillay, who's with me now. When you spoke to the Council about the enormity of the situation, and I think people know you. You're the former High Commissioner of Human Rights. You had a very distinguished judicial career as well. Have you ever seen anything like this before?
We have never seen anything like this and this extent, and that's why I said even the attack on United Nations, unprecedented. The number of victims, unprecedented, has never happened before in every other commission's report. So the figures are unbelievable. So I delivered the report, and I pointedly asked the member states to read the two big conference papers that accompany the report. The report itself is limited to 10,700 words. And with this enormous conflict, how can we put details in there? I noticed from the reaction of both Palestine and Israel, the ambassadors said we didn't address their issues sufficiently. I will be telling them to read the detailed papers that accompany this. Enormous task, but I truly value this kind of interactive dialogue. I value that this Human Rights Council took it out of the political arena, really, and planted it squarely in terms of international law. Speaker after speaker, ambassador after ambassador today supported our recommendation of respect for international law, for justice and accountability.
When I read through the report, and there's a lot to read, it seems to me, and yours is an ongoing investigation, that even though you've covered so much, there are perhaps things that aren't in it. I'm thinking, for example, attacks on hospitals and medical facilities. I mean, is there more to come?
There's much more to come. We had to cut off our presentation from 7th October to 31st December. Our next report will be delivered before the General Assembly at the United Nations in New York, and that will cover what you've just described, and the effect of education of children, for instance. All these are important. In this report, we did investigate sexual violence on both sides. I think it's tragic that Israel is preventing us from seeing victims inside Israel. You know, the ambassador described people she knew personally, a mother who lost her child, the effects of sexual violence. Then how can they explain that they're preventing those victims from seeing UN commission that will faithfully investigate and get the voices of their victims out?
Because you've not been allowed to go to Gaza, you've not been allowed to go to Israel, you are not allowed to operate according to the Israelis, but of course the International Court of Justice has said you should be there.
I welcome that. One of the very strident recommendations from the International Court of Justice is that the Commission, the UN Commission, in charge of investigation, be allowed there. And, you know, even I hoped, as a law-abiding person, that Israel will comply with that specific order of the ICJ. We've written to them and we have no response, as we have had no response to our repeated requests in the past for access. And what I find particularly disturbing is they not only deny us access into Israel and Gaza, but the whole of Palestine. We need to talk to the victims there as well. You know, there's been some complaint that we have not investigated sexual violence fully on the part of Israeli soldiers and Palestinian women. Well, we need to get there to speak to the victims ourselves. And the Commission will think about how we can take this further. There's an order of court ordering Israel to let us in, and they're not in compliance.
You talk about the International Court of Justice. There's the International Criminal Court as well, and you're well aware that the prosecutor there wants arrest warrants. He wants those to be granted. Given all of the evidence that you've seen, and you can make legal findings as well, although you're not a court, do you think there'll be more cases coming in the International Criminal Court?
Well, I can't speak for the prosecutor, but I can tell you authoritatively that we have a memorandum of understanding with the prosecutor, and we have now furnished them with like 7,000 pieces of information, video material, and the open source material that we have verified. Our information comes from the entire United Nations, all the different agencies. So we have shared the information. I'd like to think that that would have been very helpful for them to draft their indictment.
And as a former prosecutor yourself, do you think that information, that is actionable, all the information you've shared?
Just a correction, I'm not a former prosecutor, always on the side of defense. Former judge of that court, yes. The ICC. When we say we ourselves draw a conclusion that the occupation is unlawful now, and that is now before the ICJ. And when we say crimes, such as we named, are being committed in both on October 7th by Hamas and also by Israeli military forces, we are basing that on evidence and facts that we've gathered. So therefore, I think I'm on safe ground in thinking that if the judges get to see that kind of detailed evidence, I don't see why they wouldn't come to a similar conclusion on the crimes that are being committed that violate international law.
Thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera. I know you've got to go and address a news conference in a moment, so we won't keep you anymore. But thank you for speaking to us here at the UN Geneva headquarters, European headquarters of the UN, where the UN Human Rights Council has been sitting, listening to that commission of inquiry and that very, very damning, detailed report that you've been hearing about.
James Bays, many thanks indeed.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.